Today, I want to point out three things about how you handle money that came directly from Babylon. The first thing is you divide your income into different categories. In fact, you probably think about money in terms of expenses, savings, and investments, or something similar. The second thing that's ancient is you're obsessed with building wealth that lasts beyond your lifetime. You think about generational wealth, about creating something that outlives you. And the third thing is that you accept debt as normal, as a tool, as something that is just part of life. Specifically, you think borrowing money to buy things is perfectly acceptable, right? You take out mortgages, student loans, car loans, and you don't even question it. But as we'll discuss, that's strange because for most of human history, debt was either forbidden or considered shameful. You'd be much freer if you understood where these ideas came from. So this sort of behavior is not natural. If you think about it, what you should really understand is that your entire financial worldview was invented. And because once you understand this, and given the fact that the Babylonians created the template that all modern finance follows, you can actually see how the game really works. Okay. So if you understand the Babylonian system, you're far better able to use money properly. You're far more likely to build lasting wealth. But instead, you follow modern financial advice. Modern banking doesn't make sense when you see it came from ancient debt slavery. What the Babylonians really created was a system of control. What they really invented was using money to organize society. They wanted to manage resources efficiently. They wanted to control populations. That's what they really wanted. But instead, you're told money is just a neutral tool for trade. That is a lie. Now, if you borrow money in the modern system, it's really a trap, right? The most that you can hope for is maybe to pay off your debts before you die if you're really, really disciplined. But you're not going to escape the system. You are not going to be truly financially free. All right, so the situation as it is really bizarre where we're using financial technology invented by ancient priest kings and we think it's modern innovation. So it's a really old game. And so the question I want to look at today is, what is this Babylonian system? And the answer I will show is that because the Babylonians created something so powerful, so useful for controlling people, every empire since has copied it. Okay. The Babylonian money system created the financial framework that every civilization after them has used and which the entire world operates on today because it's the most effective way to organize economic activity. Does that make sense? All right. So first I want to go into some history and explain to you how we got to where we are. This is the ancient world around 2000 to 2500 billion CE, the time of the Babylonian Empire. As you can see, Babylon was located in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was a civilization that emerged in the Fertile Crescent, and it became the most advanced economic system the world had ever seen. How did this happen? The first thing you need to understand is that before Babylon, most human societies operated on very simple economics. People bartered, they traded goods directly, they lived in small communities where everyone knew each other. The idea of abstract money, of credit, of financial contracts didn't really exist in any sophisticated way. And at this time in history, the main challenge was organizing large-scale agriculture and construction projects. If you wanted to build irrigation systems or temples or city walls, you needed to coordinate thousands of workers. And at this point in history, you couldn't just trade chickens for labor. The scale was too big. But then the Babylonians had a breakthrough. They developed writing, specifically cuneiform script on clay tablets. And so suddenly, you could record transactions, track debts, and make contracts. Now the Babylonian priests and kings had to create a system to manage this new capability. They had to invent money as we know it. Remember, at this time in history, the most valuable thing was agricultural surplus. In fact, if you controlled enough grain, well, you could feed an army, build a city, and establish a dynasty. You became one of the most powerful people in the region. So now the priests and the emerging bureaucratic class had a problem because you can't physically move grain around for every transaction. So they had to discover new ways to represent value abstractly. This is what they invented. So they made economic activity standardized and recordable. But the third innovation that happened was interest on loans. All these resources were being stored in temples and palaces, and what the Babylonian authorities realized is, hey, we can lend these resources out and charge for the service. All right. Now, the concept of interest was born, and the most important aspect of this, of course, was that it was written into law in the Code of Hammurabi, and it was enforced by the state.
Okay.
This was a state-sanctioned financial system that made lending profitable while giving authorities control over economic activity. Now you have this new system where the old barter economy is being replaced by something far more sophisticated. And because of how it's structured, the Babylonian system became incredibly powerful, centralized, and extractive, or the words we use are financial control and debt management. Incredibly powerful just means that the temple and palace controlled vast resources. Centralized just means that now all economic activity flowed through official channels. The Babylonians created institutions that monitored everything. So they recorded transactions, tracked debts, and enforced contracts. They had total information about economic activity. So very quickly, even though this system made commerce and large-scale projects possible, it also created inequality and debt slavery because the system is designed to transfer wealth to creditors. It traps people in cycles of debt. It gives massive power to those who control the records. And it's incredibly efficient at organization. Because of this, what's happening is that the Babylonian economy, the temple bureaucracy, especially the scribes and the merchant class, are becoming much more sophisticated, organized, and dominant. Now that you have this financial technology, what's going to happen is that the culture is going to change. So the old tribal system was based on kinship and personal relationships, and it emphasized mutual aid and communal responsibility. That's what earlier societies looked like. The Babylonian system and its administrators needed to create a new mindset to make abstract financial relationships seem normal. So they developed new concepts which we call property rights and contractual obligations. Imagine, tribal society is really about sharing and reciprocity, but the Babylonian ideology insists on individual ownership, on recorded debts, on legal enforcement of contracts. The problem, though, is that people still operated on personal trust and informal agreements. Many of them resisted the new formalized system, but most had to adapt. So what's going to happen is that the Babylonian authorities and the scribal class are going to decide to embed these concepts into law and religion. This starts a transformation. In fact, an entire cultural shift happens throughout Mesopotamia called the financialization of society. So ostensibly, it's about making commerce more efficient and fair. But there are lots of other underlying purposes as well. But the main thing you need to know is that thousands and thousands of people fell into debt. In fact, debt slavery became so common that Babylonian kings periodically had to decree debt forgiveness to prevent total social collapse. This creates a fundamental tension because if there's all this financial innovation and you're creating all this wealth, why are so many people ending up enslaved by debt? You're a farmer, you took out a loan to buy seed after a bad harvest, but if the next harvest is also bad and you can't repay, how is it fair that you lose your land and your family becomes enslaved? So what's going to happen is this. The Babylonians are going to decide to create a legal framework around debt. This is what we call the Code of Hammurabi. Around 1750 BCE, a comprehensive legal code was established. In this code, King Hammurabi establishes written laws governing economic relationships, including detailed rules about debt. And so you're like, okay, why would he do that? Why would he create such extensive regulations about loans and interest? The thing you need to understand is that throughout Babylonian history, what makes the system work is that debt is legally enforceable, but also somewhat regulated. The authorities enforce debts, but also occasionally forgive them. This is a balancing act. Before, if you were a debtor and you couldn't repay your loan, you faced enslavement or loss of land, right? The problem, though, is that, one, if too many people fall into debt slavery, the economy collapses, in which case the whole system fails. Second, enslaved debtors can't pay taxes, in which case the state loses revenue. And the third problem is that widespread debt slavery could lead to revolt. These debtors would have no hope and might rebel. But as a society trying to function, you can't have everyone enslaved. Now, if you're living in Babylon, you're now part of a sophisticated debt economy with periodic resets. This creates a pattern that today we call the debt cycle or boom and bust. Think of how modern economies go through cycles of credit expansion and debt crisis. The system was invented in Babylon, where debt accumulates until it becomes unsustainable, and then there's a reset. But the Babylonians created this, and they based their entire civilization around this pattern. Now, the first major export of this system was to the surrounding empires because Babylon's wealth and power were obvious and other civilizations couldn't compete. If Babylon could organize resources so efficiently through their financial system, then they would dominate everyone. They basically controlled trade and military power through superior economic organization. What other civilizations did was they copied the Babylonian model and they adopted cuneiform writing for record keeping, implemented similar debt and interest systems, and created temple and palace economies which spread the system. So now the Babylonian financial model is spreading. This is how it works. The Babylonian merchants and scribes traveled throughout the region, and like we discussed, they were highly skilled. What they did was they primarily taught their methods to other civilizations. So what happened when Babylon traded with neighbors is they would spread their financial practices and influence other economies primarily by demonstrating the superiority of written contracts and standardized measures. Other civilizations saw how sophisticated Babylon was, but through adopting these practices, essentially imported the whole system, including its flaws and contradictions. What's going to happen is that Babylonian financial technology, writing, accounting, interest-based lending, is going to transfer to other civilizations. Other civilizations are going to adopt these methods and create similar systems. Very quickly, this spread throughout the ancient world. This transformed how everyone thought about money. But not only that, you also have the later empires as well with the same idea. The Persians conquered Babylon and then adopted their administrative and financial systems. It went to Persia, and then the same methods with Persian characteristics spread throughout their empire. Then this knowledge was passed to the Greeks and later the Romans. The entire Western financial tradition comes from Babylon. Now the question is, how was this possible? How was Babylon able to create a system that every subsequent civilization adopted? The answer is Babylon simply created something so useful for organizing large-scale societies that everyone who wanted to build an empire needed it. Look at this, guys. What are the major features of modern finance? Well, they are loans with interest, written contracts and legal enforcement, accounting and double-entry bookkeeping, and debt instruments and credit systems. Look at any modern bank, any mortgage, any bond. Guess what, guys? These are Babylonian inventions. So the ancient Babylonian system is still the foundation of modern finance. But it evolved from clay tablets to computer databases, from temple scribes to investment bankers, and from ancient Mesopotamia to global capitalism. And it's still the system that organizes economic activity worldwide today. All right? Now, there's a question that people often ask. It's a very good question. The question is this: if this system is 4,000 years old and has always created debt, slavery, and inequality, why do we still use it? It's a good question. And the answer is because it's incredibly effective at organizing large-scale economic activity. Why do we still use Babylonian financial methods in the modern world? Because nobody has invented anything better that works at scale. As a civilization, you need ways to coordinate resources across vast distances and populations to fund large projects that take years or decades to create predictable economic relationships. People need to trust that contracts will be enforced, that measurements are standardized, that debts are tracked accurately. If you try to organize a modern economy without these tools, it collapses into chaos. In fact, your economic complexity becomes impossible. So the classic example is like countries that try to operate without sophisticated financial systems. They can't build infrastructure. They can't coordinate large-scale production. They can't compete globally. But guess what? They're forced to adopt the Babylonian model. There's actually no viable alternative at scale. There's no other method that's proven to work for complex civilizations. It's actually just the best solution anyone has found. I'm not saying the system is perfect, and I'm not saying there's no room for improvement, but I am saying that the Babylonian innovations solve real problems that still exist. And if you want to understand modern finance, guess what? You need to see that it's built on 4,000-year-old foundations. So in some ways, you would say this is the most successful technology in human history. This system is not just still in use, but it's actually expanded and improved over millennia. It is the foundation of all complex civilization. But unfortunately, this system also has the same flaws it had in ancient Babylon. So even though the technology has advanced from clay tablets to blockchain, the fundamental logic remains unchanged. But then what happens when debt becomes unsustainable? Crisis occurs. You guys know what happens when the debt cycle reaches its limit. Modern economies face the same problem Babylon did. Debt accumulates to unsustainable levels. Periodic crises or resets become necessary. The system either adapts or faces collapse. Do you understand? So if the Babylonian system has these inherent flaws that create debt crises, what should we do differently? This is a really important question to answer. So let me explain different perspectives. The first perspective is this. The system works incredibly well for what it was designed to do. What it does effectively is organize complex economic activity across large populations. That's what it's good at. The most economically successful civilizations in history tend to be those that mastered these Babylonian financial tools, that understood debt and credit, and that used accounting and contracts effectively. So why do we keep using a 4,000-year-old system? Because the fundamental problems of economic organization haven't changed, meaning that humans still need to coordinate resources, fund large projects, and create predictable economic relationships. The Babylonians solved these problems in ways that still work, and the alternatives that have been tried tend to fail at scale. So the system persists because it's genuinely useful despite its flaws. The question is whether the flaws are fixable or inherent. Then the question is, can you have the benefits without the debt slavery? And the answer tentatively is that you need to understand the Babylonian principles properly, not just copy them blindly. We're talking about understanding why they created debt jubilees, not just the tools. You have to learn from both the innovations and the mistakes, even though most people only learn the technical methods. Does that make sense? So in the long term, you can have sophisticated finance without inevitable debt crisis. You can use these tools for human flourishing instead of control. You can create economic systems that serve people rather than enslave them. But in the short term, you have to recognize we're using an ancient system designed for ancient purposes, even though we pretend it's modern and neutral. That's the reality of where we are, because we inherited these methods without understanding their origins. We use Babylonian tools without Babylonian wisdom. We've forgotten that periodic resets were part of the original system. And that leaves us vulnerable to crises that the ancients knew how to prevent as well, because the Babylonians understood debt jubilees were necessary. So think of it as using ancient technology without the instruction manual. Think of modern economists who don't study Babylonian debt forgiveness. They're confused why debt keeps causing crises, and they propose austerity, which makes things worse. And they don't realize the ancients solved this problem, and now they're repeating mistakes that Hammurabi could have warned them about. Do you understand? So it's a really strange situation in that we're using technology we don't fully understand, but we act like we invented it and know better than the ancients. If you ignore the wisdom of the originators, you miss crucial insights. You create problems unnecessarily. And what the Babylonians knew is that debt-based systems need periodic resets, right? So what we should learn is the complete Babylonian model, including the relief mechanisms. And it's important because without that understanding, we keep having unnecessary financial crises that destroy lives.